Hello, my Christian friends. I'm Dr. Donald Jones, and welcome to 10 Minutes of Theology from the Bible. Welcome to our series entitled Defending Your Life, How Christians May Defend Themselves Against Attack. This is based on my new book of the same name. I put a link in the description below if you would like to purchase it. This book is not a discussion of the Second Amendment, which guarantees us the right to bear arms, but instead a comprehensive, detailed biblical explanation of God's command to bear arms. Self-defense and the defense of others pours out of His very nature, power, and attributes, and is an intricate part of His societal and relational structures on the earth and in the heavenly places. Whatever our opinions are concerning this subject, we are to submit ourselves to God's commandments in the Bible, and God has a lot to say about it. These videos will be short summaries of the scriptural presentations in each chapter. This is the 13th session based on chapter 13 entitled The Certain Urgency. Throughout biblical history, people have always had a certain urgency in preparing for the defense of themselves and others. Individuals, families, clans, tribes, cities, regions, and nations sought to build and develop weapons to protect themselves and others. In this discussion, we'll look first at the defense of the staff. When we study the people of Israel and their basic weapon of defense, we discover that it was the staff. Every male carried a staff. It was used first for protection against man and animals. Only secondarily was it used for other purposes. Though somewhat obvious when pointed out, yet it often goes unnoticed. In any discussion of ancient Jewish life, it must be noted that carrying staffs was a common Jewish practice. This was not the sole custom of shepherds, as some might think. It was quite typical among the Hebrews to carry a staff for a variety of uses, but primarily for protection. First, we'll look at the staff in the Old Testament. We literally see the staff throughout the Bible. It is not just with shepherds, as we just mentioned. The staff is one of those objects not noticeable or discussed, but was an intricate part of Jewish life. Though its significance is not directly discussed, it was incredibly important. We will begin our study of the staff with the discussion of the actual terms used. Number one, the Hebrew terms. An ancient staff used by common people was a thick stick of wood which was cut to various sizes. There are several Hebrew terms that refer to the staff and other types of rods or sticks that could be used for a variety of purposes, but primarily the way we would think of the staff. It is important to note that these different Hebrew terms are translated with different English words depending on the context and the particular translator. Yet, these terms are used interchangeably as we would use synonyms in the English language to refer to the same object, but perhaps to bring out certain nuances of meaning. It is critical to note that at times two Hebrew words are used in the same sentence to refer to the same instrument, not two different instruments. Often, the Hebrew words would use parallel phrases in order to emphasize a particular truth, idea, or concept. As a result, they would use synonymous terms. When this occurs, the English translator will use rod, scepter, and staff. These do not refer to necessarily different objects, but simply the reference to the same staff with its different symbolic meanings or nuances. Except in a few obscure passages, there is no reason to believe that anything other than a staff is referenced. That's important to note. The concept of a rod as a separate, more combative club, as distinguished from a staff, comes from one popular writer's conception of his childhood experience among shepherds. I won't mention his name, but you probably know who I'm speaking of. In Psalm 23:4, David speaks to this truth. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. He interprets the first Hebrew word as a club, and the second as a staff, claiming that shepherds always carried both. This is not the case. Though he references his past experience, there is absolutely no indication that shepherds carried more than one implement. Here the psalmist is looking at God as a shepherd through the lenses of various uses of the staff and utilizes a parallel approach. He's speaking of the same staff. The translators are using two different English words because the Hebrew has two different terms, but they're synonyms. How would God's staff comfort him? It was used for protection, examination, discipline, and was a symbol of his presence, direction, and care. Two different instruments are not envisioned here, but different aspects of God's care for us who gives comfort. Two synonyms are used by the writer to bring emphasis to the truth. That is a common Hebrew experience or way of writing. Before this writer wrote his book, it was always interpreted this way. Second, the common occurrence of the staff. A staff was carried by every man throughout ancient times. Because they could be made quickly and easily, they were available to all. Other weapons, such as the sword, would have to be purchased. The best Old Testament example of the common use of the staff is found in the description by Moses in the great story of the Exodus from Egypt. God's people had been slaves for 70 years, and the Lord sent Moses to free them. Each time Pharaoh refused, God sent a powerful plague upon the land. Finally, after the ninth divine disaster, God determined that he would take the firstborn of every Egyptian family in the land. To exempt themselves from this angel of death, the Hebrews were to put lamb's blood around the door to mark their home for protection. Before this event occurred, God commanded his people to commemorate this great act of deliverance. They were to do this through the celebration of the Passover meal annually. The Passover meal was to bring to remembrance to the mind of every Jew what God had done to redeem them. This foreshadowed the coming of his Messiah. In Exodus 12, the Lord through Moses shares aspects of this meal. Exodus 12:11. This is how you shall eat it, with your belt on your waist, your shoes on your feet, and your staff in your hand. And you shall eat it in haste. It is Yahweh's Passover. Notice they were to eat the meal with the basic instruments of travel: belt, sandals, staff. The belt held up the long tunic to walk, the sandals protected the feet, and the staff was used for their family's protection, the tending of their family's animals, and other uses. They would eat ready to leave. God mentions the staff because it was one of the essentials of the life of the Hebrews. When Judah refused to follow God's law of inheritance by giving his son to Tamar, his other son's widow, Tamar took action. She disguised herself as a prostitute and stood on the side of the road in the path of Judah. For her services, Judah promised a young goat. Since he did not have it on hand, he gave her his signet ring, his cord, and his staff. These were the basic and essential items a man carried. The signet ring had engraved on it the family seal to verify legal transactions. The staff often had a top with a personalized image. The three would be used to identify him. In Genesis 38:18, Moses records what happens. What pledge will I give you? She said, your signet and your cord and your staff that is in your hand. He gave them to her and came into her, and she could see by him. The point is, Judah was carrying a staff. In Genesis 32, as Jacob envisions a difficult encounter with his estranged brother Esau on his way home to his father Abraham's land, he begs God for divine protection. He begins his prayer with praises for the Lord's blessing over the years he was with his uncle Laban. Genesis 32:10. I am not worthy of the least of all the loving kindnesses and of all the truth which you have shown to your servant. For with just my staff I passed over this Jordan. Now I have become 2 companies. Here he indicates that he had begun his stay with only the most common and simplest of possessions, his staff. Now he had so much more. This staff is mentioned by the author of Hebrews in chapter 11. Hebrews 11:21. By faith Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of the sons of Joseph and worshipped, leaning on the top of his staff. In Exodus 7, when Aaron assisted Moses in bringing the plagues on Egypt, he asked Aaron to use his staff, which was something every man carried. Exodus 7:9-10. When Pharaoh speaks to you, saying, "Perform a miracle," then you shall tell Aaron, "Take your rod," could easily be translated staff, "and cast it down before Pharaoh, that it become a serpent." Moses and Aaron went into Pharaoh, and they did so, as Yahweh had commanded, and Aaron cast down his staff or rod, either one, before Pharaoh and before his servants, and it became a serpent. When the sorcerers of Pharaoh saw this, they also had staffs and turned them into serpents. Exodus 7:11-12. Then Pharaoh also called for the wise men and the sorcerers. They also, the magicians of Egypt, did the same thing with their enchantments, for they each cast down their rods or staffs, same instrument, and they became serpents. But Aaron's rod or staff swallowed up their rods or staffs. Of course, their serpents were eaten by Aaron's. Then Aaron used his staff to turn the Nile into blood. Prophets also carried staffs like other men. In 2 Kings 4, when Elijah decided to raise the Shunammite's son from the dead, his initial step was to send his servant Gehazi ahead of him and lay Elisha's staff upon the child's head. Though it took the prophet himself laying on top of the child to raise him, we have once again see the use of a staff. In Isaiah 36, the prophet warns the people of God not to trust in Pharaoh's might rather than his power. Isaiah 36:6. Behold, you trusted the staff of this bruised reed, even in Egypt, which if a man leans on it, it will go into his hand and pierce it. So is Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to all who trust in him. A staff would often be made from a hollow, straight reed. Trusting in Pharaoh to help them against their enemy was like leaning on one of these reeds which broke and cut the hand. They could not rely on him, but should rely on God instead. This would be understood by the average person because the staff was so common. All of these passages demonstrate the daily use of the staff. Now, what was the staff's primary use? I've already alluded to it, but let's discuss it for a minute. The staff was utilized primarily for self-defense and the defense of others. It could readily become a weapon to protect oneself. A powerful illustration of the use of the staff for protection was the incident that occurred between David and Goliath. Though David was a shepherd, he carried with him the humble, common instruments of defense. In 1 Samuel 17, when young David faced Goliath, he had 2 weapons in his hand, his staff and his sling. 1 Samuel 17:40. He took his staff in his hand and chose for himself 5 smooth stones out of the brook and put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, which he had. His sling was in his hand, and he came near to the Philistine. The staff was used for battle close up, while the sling was used for combat at a distance. The warrior Goliath was so huge that distant combat would be David's only hope. Notice the great warrior's reaction. 1 Samuel 17, 42-44. When the Philistine looked around and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth and ruddy, and had a good-looking face. The Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" The Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and to the animals of the field." The Philistine mocked David because he was not a seasoned warrior, bringing a warrior's weapons against him. Instead, he was a commoner with a common weapon, staff. The word translated stick is the Hebrew word meaning staff. Stick, staff, rod. All synonyms, all English synonyms. The sling was probably out of sight and unexpected. Since the staff would not work against this giant, David used his sling. This killed the giant. I mentioned this story because it demonstrates that the staff was the basic weapon of a common man versus the weapons of a soldier. David carried a sling together with the staff for combat with animals. When Saul attempted to put his armor on David, it didn't feel right, and David rejected it. The young man had already explained that the staff and sling was enough to kill large animals with the help of the Lord. Here, the sling would have been used to injure and stop the beasts, and the staff to finish them off. Next, the staff as defense in combat. Since the staff was used for daily protection by common folk, sometimes it was used by those who must engage in combat. In 2 Samuel 23, one of David's men used a staff to fight in hand-to-hand combat against a warrior's spear. It was used most commonly by an ordinary fellow, but at the same time it could be used by a warrior. Here's an example. 2 Samuel 23:21. He killed a huge Egyptian, and the Egyptian had a spear in his hand. But he went down to him with a staff, same word, and plucked the spear out of the Egyptian's hand and killed him with his own spear. It is described again in 1 Chronicles 11:23. Here the author uses the same Hebrew word that we have for staff, or one of the synonyms. 1 Chronicles 11:23. He killed an Egyptian, a man of great stature, 5 cubits high. In the Egyptian's hand was a spear, like a weaver's beam, and he went down to him with a staff, plucked the spear out of the Egyptian's hand, and killed him with his own spear. Some translators want to translate the word to club, but it is never used that way. Plus, how valiant would it be to fight a spear-wielding soldier with a club? That wasn't the point of the passage. The use of the staff would have demonstrated great skill and courage. Also, how would one pluck or snatch a spear away from a man with a club half the size? Not going to happen. The point of the story is this. One of David's bold and courageous men took on an ordinary staff, went after this huge Egyptian, and defeated him with his own spear. He would have had to disarm him with the staff first. The common staff could easily be cut sharp at one end and used much like a spear for the lowest rank of troops who could not afford other kinds of weapons. In Habakkuk 3, the prophet is reviewing the story of the Lord, God's great deliverance of Israel from the Egyptian army. Habakkuk 3:14. You pierced the heads of the warriors with their own spears, uses the word staff. They came as a whirlwind to scatter me, gloating as if to devour the poor in secret. Here the normal words for spear are not used. Instead, he uses the word staff. Yet it is utilized in the context of battle. So of course the staff was used by the ordinary man and could be used by the lowest rank of soldiers. The staff also had other uses. Here are the secondary uses. The staff was a part of daily life because not only was it used for protection, but other things. People could use it to pick up objects, carrying baskets, crushing plants, counting sheep, to stabilize themselves like a cane or a crutch, or even to dig if necessary. There are passages in the Bible that discuss that. It was used as a symbol of authority and rulership and usually called a scepter. Same staff. Translators using a different word. They were decorated, made of gold or silver, and had an insignia on it. Psalm 2:9. You shall break them with a rod, staff of iron. You shall dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. Here a messianic prophecy talking of the Lord. The staff in the New Testament, it works exactly the same way. Though the staff is not mentioned as prominently in the New Testament as in the Old, it has the same purposes and use. The Greek terms. In the Greek language, 2 terms are used in reference to the staff. As in the Hebrew, two synonyms are used and translated differently depending on the context and the translator, but always refer to the common staff. There was a different term for a club which was carried by the mob among those who came to arrest Jesus. We'll look at that in another section. As in the Old Testament, the staff was still in use in New Testament times. First, the staff was a common instrument to carry in the New Testament. When Jesus decided to send his 12 disciples out on a short missionary endeavor, he instructed them concerning what to bring and not bring. In Mark 6, 8-10, Jesus told his disciples to follow the biblical mandate that a worker is worthy of a support and to rely on people to whom they were preaching for support. Therefore, they were to bring only the necessities: sandals, a tunic, and a staff. The rest would be provided for as they trusted God. They were not to acquire any new supplies. Even Jesus himself would have been carrying a staff as every man did at the time. This custom was so assumed and such a natural part of life that it would not be mentioned unless it directly pertained to the purposes of the inspired writers. Also, the staff would have still been used as a first line of defense. Though the Jews in the New Testament were under Roman rule, if problems occurred, the Romans would become involved in the protection of the people. Nevertheless, as with modern police, they cannot always arrive on time and often did not become involved. So having a staff allowed the common people to defend themselves and their loved ones, and it would be a great deterrent to those who might want to harm them. Paul described the many dangers inherent in traveling as he explained to the Corinthians his qualifications for ministry. Some of those qualifications involved facing the dangers traveling in the first century to preach the gospel. 2 Corinthians 11:26. I have been in travels often, perils of rivers, perils of robbers, perils from my countrymen, perils from the Gentiles, perils in the city, perils in the wilderness, perils in the sea, perils among false brothers. Most of the dangers would have required a weapon. The staff would have been the common one to possess. In his story of the Good Samaritan, Jesus provides an example of the dangers of robbers who steal from and beat their victims. Though this story was fiction, it was realistic fiction based on real-life possibilities. In John 10, Jesus spoke of thieves who came to steal sheep. Though the Lord is speaking spiritually here, it was based on real-life experiences. There were also dangers of wild animals, which would be included in Paul's perils in the wilderness and perils in the cities. The staff was their basic weapon. It was not just a walking stick as we see them in our culture. Here is one example from the book. In John 11, when Jesus had received word that Lazarus was sick, he purposely remained where he was to allow Lazarus to die. After 2 days, Jesus announced that they should travel to Judea. Then the disciples immediately reacted by asking a question. John 11:8. The disciples said, "Rabbi, the Jews were just trying to stone you, and are you going there again?" Jesus did not respond to the question, but explained that Lazarus was asleep and needed to be wakened. The disciples thought he meant that Lazarus was physically asleep rather than dead. This puzzled them. Could Lazarus just recover with Jesus being put in great danger of death? Once Jesus revealed that he was speaking of physical death, Thomas made an amazing declaration. John 11:16. Thomas, therefore, who is called Didymus, said to his fellow disciples, "Let's go also, that we may die with him." What could Thomas have really meant? Did he mean that they would follow Jesus and all stand around and watch him be stoned? Did he think they would follow him and all stand with him passively while he would be killed in some way? I suggest that he would have meant that they would all go and stand with him and defend themselves and him if necessary. With what? Staff. This would not have been a legal trial. It would have been a mob desiring to stone him as soon as they saw the Lord. It is most likely that they proceeded with staffs in hand to defend our Lord against a mob attack. Thomas expected to lose that battle and die with Christ. The staff also had secondary uses, as with the Old Testament. Though we do not see the staff mentioned as much in the New Testament, we can assume it was used in exactly the same way. Here's a few examples. When Jesus was on the cross and became thirsty, it was a staff with a sponge on the top that was used to give him vinegar to drink. Matthew 27:48. Immediately one of them ran and took a sponge and filled it with vinegar and put it on a reed, the word for staff, and gave him a drink. So the staff was utilized to pick up objects in the first century as well. In Revelation 11, John describes using the staff to measure the heavenly temple, which was another of the uses of a staff by the people. Revelation 11:1. A rod like a staff was given to me. Someone said, "Rise and measure God's temple and the altar and those who worship in it." Here the first word, rod, is the material the staff would have been made out of, which is a reed. So John measured with a staff made from a reed. Of course, it is used of the divine authority of Christ. Revelation 2:27. He, Christ, will rule them with a rod, staff, same word. The translators are using rod, but it's the same word, of iron, shattering them like clay pots. Revelation 12:5. She gave birth to a son, Christ, a male child, who is to rule all the nations with a rod, staff, of iron. Her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Revelation 19:15. Out of his mouth proceeds a sharp, double-edged sword, that with it he should strike the nations. Who? Christ, with the sword. We'll see that later. He will rule them with an iron rod. Same Hebrew word, staff, simply translated rod instead by the translators. As in Hebrew history, the staff continued to be used to designate rulership. In Revelation, it refers to the rulership believers will have in the millennium. In chapter 2, Jesus tells the church at Thyatira that if they persist in their faith and obedience, he will allow them to rule with him. Revelation 2:26-27. He overcomes, and he who keeps my words to the end, to him I will give authority over the nations. He will rule them with a rod, same word, staff of iron, shattering them like clay pots, as I also have received of my Father. The point is that the staff has always been carried by Jewish men and was carried by the disciples. Though it had many uses, the main and primary use was self-defense and the defense of others. Now let's talk for a moment about the club. There are two Greek words used interchangeably for the staff, yet when the Lord Jesus was arrested by the Jewish leaders, the temple police, and a mob, the mob was carrying clubs, a different Greek term. Matthew 26:55. In that hour Jesus said to the multitudes, "Have you come out as against a robber with swords and clubs to seize me? I sat daily in the temple teaching, and you didn't arrest me." The Jewish leaders would not have been carrying clubs. They would leave the arrest up to the temple police. This group would have been carrying swords. The mob of malcontents, troublemakers, and rabble-rousers would have grabbed some wood or branches and taken off with the crowd. The Greek word translated club refers to the sticks that are made from trees. A club would have been cut off a branch, quickly shaped, and taken to commit their mayhem. If a man felt the danger went beyond the protection of the staff, other weapons could be obtained. Of course, when men went to war, they used a variety of them. So let's look at some other weapons used for self-defense and the defense of others. Besides the staff, weapons of various kinds are found all throughout the scriptures. They are mentioned as far back as Genesis 3 after man's fall. Once Adam and Eve were thrown out of the garden, God placed an angel with a flaming sword to protect its entrance. He could not allow the couple to eat of the tree of life and remain in their sin forever. At the end of chapter 4, the inventor of the first weapons made of bronze and iron is identified. The final weapon is utilized at the return of Christ. The Lord Jesus returns with a sword coming out of his mouth and does battle with the evil forces of men and the demons behind them. Weapons can be used offensively and defensively. Yet, take a moment to ponder the human condition. It becomes so obvious that weapons were always created and developed for safety first. That would always be the reason. First defense, then offense, if needed. It is not the desire to attack others that is foremost on the mind of men. Rather, it is the compulsion to protect themselves and those they love from attack. As we saw in the initial chapters, murder is on the heart of some men, but defending oneself is on the heart of all men. The Bible is filled with face-to-face violent confrontations, skirmishes, and wars where weapons are used for defense. The creation and use of these weapons clearly demonstrate that self-defense and the defense of others is an anticipated necessity on an individual, regional, and national level. We have already looked at many of these battles. Nehemiah and all the ordinary people had weapons to defend themselves as they built the wall. When Jonathan's friendship with David had deepened, he gave him some of his personal items to David, this man of God. 1 Samuel 18:4. Jonathan stripped himself of the robe and gave it to David with his clothing, even including his sword, his bow, and his sash. This gave David not only a wardrobe in which to enter the court, but more suitable protection for his new status in Saul's court after conquering Goliath. The defense of ourselves and others must be important because the Bible describes so many weapons without apology and so many acts of self-defense and the defense of others without any negative connotation at all. Here are some of the weapons that were mentioned. There were axes, the bow, arrows, a quiver, the breastplate, the coat of mail, the buckler, which was a small hand shield, the chariot, the greaves, leg armor, the helmet, the mace, the shield, the sling, the spear, the sword, the torch, horses and horsemen. And for the defense of cities, there were great walls, watchtowers, and weapons on the towers. Defense was always on their minds. And this is important. A lot of those weapons were used as analogies of God's power and strength and for a variety of other spiritual truths in the Psalms and throughout the Scriptures. Used in positive ways, used in powerful spiritual ways. Remember, Paul used the armor of the Roman soldier in Ephesians 6 for the spiritual weapons of God. Lastly, weapons were invented, purchased, accepted as tribute, and taken as plunder for protection and defense because it was an anticipated necessity in an evil world. Therefore, self-defense and the defense of others is a legitimate practice against the possibility of being killed. This is Dr. Donald Jones. I would appreciate your support by taking the actions you see on my left. Goodbye, my Christian friends, and may God bless you.